Have you ever seen something so unfair that the entire world seemed to stop for a moment? This story begins with Maya Carter, a powerful black woman CEO who had worked her entire life to earn respect in boardrooms and business summits. On this particular day, Maya was boarding a flight after a major conference where she had been the keynote speaker. She was exhausted but proud, holding her first-class boarding pass that symbolized not just luxury, but the dignity she had earned through sacrifice and endless hard work. But as she walked down the narrow aisle, something happened that would ignite tension across the cabin. A man, already seated in her spot, glanced up at her with a look that mixed arrogance and entitlement. His voice was calm, yet dismissive. "I don't think you belong here." At that moment, silence fell in the row. Maya stood frozen, her ticket clutched in hand. The seat she paid for, the respect she deserved, stolen right in front of everyone. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. Passengers glanced between Maya and the men, unsure whether to speak up. Some looked away, too uncomfortable to intervene. The man, a white passenger in his early 40s, leaned back smugly as if daring her to challenge him. Maya took a breath, holding her composure, and replied firmly, "This is my seat. Here's the boarding pass." She handed it to the flight attendant who had arrived, sensing the tension. The attendant checked the ticket twice, her brows furrowed, before confirming, "Sir, this is her seat." But instead of moving, the man chuckled. "Maybe you should check again. Some of us actually paid for this." His tone dripped with condescension. Maya's heart raced, not from fear, but from the familiar sting of being dismissed, undermined, and reduced despite her success. She wasn't just fighting for a seat on this plane. She was fighting for every moment she had been told she didn't belong. The cabin's quiet stretched longer, everyone waiting, who would win this silent battle. The attendant, clearly unsettled, insisted again that the men stand up. But his refusal created a standoff. Maya, still standing tall in her tailored suit, refused to let anger take over. Her calm presence, however, seemed to unnerve him. She turned slightly to the passengers watching, her voice clear and steady. "This isn't just about a seat. It's about respect." A ripple went through the crowd. Some passengers nodded, while others remained frozen in silence. The man crossed his arms, muttering about people making a scene. It was then that a second flight attendant joined, and whispers spread across the cabin. Why wouldn't he give up the seat? What gave him the right to defy both a passenger and the crew? The tension was building towards something no one expected. And Maya knew that whatever happened here would not just end with her, it would be remembered. The captain was called. A tall figure in uniform approached, his voice calm yet firm. "Sir, you need to vacate this seat immediately. We can resolve this properly, but not here." Instead of complying, the man smirked and declared loudly, "I'm not moving for her. Find me another seat." The word "her" carried an edge that sliced through the air. The cabin erupted in murmurs. Some passengers gasped, while others grew restless, frustrated at the delay. Maya didn't flinch, but her heart pounded. She wasn't just defending herself, she was suddenly representing everyone who had ever been made small in the face of arrogance. The captain locked eyes with her, then turned to the men. "Sir, this is your final warning." But before the men could respond, a voice rose from the back of the cabin. A passenger stood up and said, "This isn't right. Give her the seat. She paid for." That single spark lit the fire. Voices grew louder. A young woman added, "We all saw her ticket." Another man, clearly tired of the delay, snapped, "Just get up and stop wasting our time." For the first time, the man's confidence faltered. He looked around and realized the cabin wasn't with him. Maya remained composed, her posture dignified, though inside she felt a storm of emotions. She hadn't asked for this confrontation, but now it seemed the entire plane had been pulled into her fight for dignity. The attendants, seeing the shift, pressed again, "Sir, please. This cannot continue." The man stood slowly, glaring at Maya, and muttered under his breath, but his words were drowned by the sounds of passengers clapping. Yet the victory was short-lived. As the man grabbed his bag and moved into the aisle, he spat out, "You people always play the victim." The cheers turned into outrage. Now the captain had no choice. The captain made his decision instantly. "This flight will not be leaving until this passenger is removed." Gasps echoed, and the man's face turned red with disbelief. Security was called onto the plane. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling the weight she had been holding in. Passengers now turned to her, not with pity, but with admiration. Some whispered words of encouragement as the man was escorted off, still fuming. The cabin filled with clapping once again, this time louder, unified. But Maya didn't smile. She sat down finally in her rightful seat, her hands trembling slightly. She knew this wasn't just a personal win, it was a moment that symbolized every struggle she had faced silently in boardrooms, at conferences, and in closed doors where respect wasn't freely given. Now, in the open, the truth was undeniable. As the plane finally prepared for takeoff, passengers leaned in, some thanking Maya for standing tall. One older woman placed her hand over hers and whispered, "You showed us all something important today." Maya nodded, humbled, but her mind was heavy. She thought of young women watching stories like this unfold, wondering if they would ever belong in the spaces they fought to reach. She wanted them to know, yes, they did belong. The seat she claimed was more than leather and cushion, it was a symbol of earned respect. As the engines roared and the plane lifted into the sky, Maya stared out the window. She wasn't just flying to her next destination, she was carrying a message that would reach far beyond this flight. The world outside stretched wide and endless, but inside, she knew one truth with certainty: no one could ever steal her place again. But the story didn't end when the wheels left the ground. Hours later, after the flight landed, Maya collected her bag and prepared to disappear quietly into the crowd. Yet something unexpected stopped her. Passengers who had witnessed the incident began approaching her one by one. A young college student walked up, his voice soft but steady. "Ma'am, I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that with so much grace. You reminded me to never back down." Another woman, a mother traveling with her teenage daughter, added, "You didn't just fight for your seat, you showed my daughter how to stand tall in a world that tries to push you down." Maya was overwhelmed. She had never sought the spotlight, but here it was, following her down the terminal hallway. Cameras from fellow passengers who had recorded the confrontation had already gone viral online. Her story was spreading beyond the plane, turning into a message for millions who had ever been made to feel small. Maya paused, realizing something powerful: the seat she defended had become a symbol far greater than herself. And deep down, she knew her journey wasn't ending, it was only just beginning. By the next morning, Maya's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers were sending her clips of the incident, now circulating across social media platforms with millions of views. Headlines read, "CEO stands tall after discrimination on flight," and "Passenger removed after trying to take Black woman's seat." For Maya, it felt surreal. She hadn't planned to become the center of a viral moment. All she had wanted was to get home. Yet, as she scrolled through messages, she noticed a shift. People weren't just talking about the unfairness she endured, they were inspired by how she responded. Business leaders wrote that they shared the video in their companies as a lesson in dignity under pressure. Students said it gave them courage to keep pushing forward in their own lives. And mothers shared it with their daughters, saying, "Look, this is what strength looks like." Maya sat in her living room, humbled, realizing her story wasn't hers alone anymore. It had become a spark, one that reminded people everywhere that respect must always be claimed, never begged for. Days later, Maya found herself standing on a stage once again, this time, not at a business conference, but at a community event organized in her honor. The organizers had invited her to speak after her story had traveled across the world, touching millions of hearts. As she looked at the crowd, young students, professionals, mothers, and fathers, she felt a weight and a gift on her shoulders. She began softly, "I never asked for my story to be public. But maybe it was meant to be, so that each of you could see what happens when you refuse to be silenced." The audience leaned in, hanging on her every word. That seat on the plane was never about comfort. It was about dignity. And no matter who you are, where you come from, or what you've been told, you belong in the place you've worked for. Applause filled the hall, but Maya's voice cut through it with calm strength. "The world will always test your worth. But remember, your worth cannot be stolen. Not by arrogance, not by prejudice, not by anyone." In that moment, Maya realized this was bigger than her. It was a movement, a story that would keep giving courage long after the flight was forgotten. And as the cheers rose louder, she smiled, knowing that her seat had never been just on a plane, it had always been in history. After the event ended and the crowd slowly dispersed, Maya sat quietly in the green room, finally alone. The cheers were still ringing in her ears, but in the silence, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. For years she had fought battles behind closed doors, battles no one ever saw. And yet, it was one moment on a plane, one confrontation, that had exposed to the world what she had carried for so long. A soft knock came at the door. It was the same teenage girl she had noticed in the audience, her eyes bright but nervous. She handed Maya a folded note. "I just wanted to thank you. Because of you, I know I don't have to shrink anymore." The girl hugged her and left before Maya could respond. Opening the note, Maya read the words, "One day, I'll sit in my rightful seat too." Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that her story had become a mirror for others. Maya leaned back, holding the note to her chest, and whispered to herself, "Then it was all worth it." Weeks later, Maya was invited to appear on a national morning show. Sitting under the bright studio lights, she felt a strange mix of nerves and calm. The host smiled warmly and asked, "Maya, you didn't just claim your seat on that plane, you claimed a voice for so many others. What does that moment mean to you now?" Maya paused, remembering the long journey that led her here. "It means that sometimes the smallest stand can echo the loudest," she said softly. "That day, I wasn't thinking about cameras or headlines. I was simply standing for what was right. But if my story helps even one person stop apologizing for existing, then it was never just about me." The studio audience broke into applause, and online viewers flooded the live chat with messages of love and support. Yet the moment that touched Maya most wasn't the applause, it was seeing the teenage girl from the event again, now sitting in the front row with her mother, smiling proudly. Maya's heart swelled. This wasn't just her victory anymore, it was a seed planted in others, one that would continue to grow long after the headlines faded. As weeks turned into months, Maya's life began to shift in ways she had never imagined. Invitations poured in, from universities, leadership forums, and even international organizations, asking her to share her story. But Maya didn't want to just retell the moment on the plane, she wanted to use it as a bridge. At one conference, she looked out at a sea of faces, young leaders from all over the world. "The truth is," she began, "that flight wasn't the first time I was told I didn't belong. It was simply the moment when the world finally saw it happen. But belonging isn't something people can give you, it's something you must claim for yourself." The room fell silent, every word sinking deep. Afterward, dozens of students crowded around her, eager to share their own stories of exclusion and resilience. Maya listened, hugged them, and realized this was her new calling. The plane had been the beginning, but her mission was far bigger now, to remind people everywhere that their worth is not negotiable. That single stolen seat had become the start of a movement that was now unstoppable. One evening, Maya returned home after another long day of speaking engagements. She placed her bag by the door and sat quietly in her living room, finally allowing herself a moment of stillness. On the coffee table lay stacks of letters, handwritten notes from strangers across the world. Some came from small towns, others from bustling cities, but all carried the same message: "Because of you, I found my voice." Maya picked up one from a young man in South Africa. He wrote, "When I saw your story, I stopped being afraid of applying for jobs I thought I wasn't good enough for. Today, I got hired." Another was from a grandmother in Chicago who said she finally stood up to unfair treatment at her workplace. Tears welled in Maya's eyes as she realized her fight on that plane had turned into thousands of quiet victories for others. She whispered to herself, "It wasn't just about claiming my seat, it was about helping others find theirs too." For the first time in months, she smiled with peace in her heart, knowing that the ripple she created was now a wave too strong to ever be silenced. Months later, Maya stood at an international summit, her story now known across continents. Leaders, entrepreneurs, and students filled the hall, waiting for her to speak. She looked across the audience, remembering the day on the plane that had changed everything. Taking a deep breath, she began, "That seat was never just mine, it was a symbol of every space where someone has been told they don't belong. But here's the truth, you don't need permission to exist where you've worked hard to be. You've already earned it." Her words echoed like a drumbeat through the hall, and for a moment, the silence was absolute, thick with understanding. Then came the applause, rising like thunder, shaking the walls. Maya didn't see it as her victory anymore. It was theirs. It belonged to every person who had been dismissed, overlooked, or pushed aside. As she left the stage, she realized something profound: the world would remember the men who tried to steal her seat only as a footnote. But her story, the story of claiming dignity and sparking change, would live on for generations. And in that moment, Maya finally knew, she hadn't just found her seat. She had built a table where everyone was welcome. After the summit, Maya returned home to a quiet evening. She brewed herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle below. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to reflect, not as a CEO, not as a public figure, but as Maya, the woman who once simply wanted to board her flight in peace. She thought about how a single moment of injustice had grown into something far larger than she ever imagined. That stolen seat had become a story told in classrooms, boardrooms, and even living rooms around the world. Her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message. From the same teenage girl she had met earlier: "I just got accepted into my dream college. Thank you for showing me I deserve my place." Maya smiled, her eyes filling with quiet tears. She realized the true victory wasn't in the applause or headlines, it was in moments like this, where her courage helped others unlock their own. She leaned back, whispered softly to herself, "The seat was never mine alone, it belongs to everyone who dares to claim it," and felt peace knowing her journey had become a torch others would now carry forward. Months later, Maya found herself invited back to the very same airline where her journey had begun. At first, she hesitated, memories of that day still lingered, but something inside urged her to go. When she arrived, she was greeted not by apologies, but by change. The airline had launched a new initiative, training its staff on dignity, inclusion, and respect, all inspired by the story that began with her stolen seat. As she toured the training center, Maya listened quietly to young attendants practicing scenarios on how to stand up for passengers. One trainee turned to her and said, "We learned from you. Because of your courage, we'll never let something like that happen again." Maya felt her heart swell. This was bigger than her now, her fight had reshaped an entire system. Standing by the window overlooking the runway, she whispered, "What started in pain has ended in purpose." And as a jet soared into the sky, she realized that her legacy wasn't only in the speeches or the headlines, it was in the quiet transformations, the changes that would ripple long after she was gone. The world hadn't just witnessed her story, it had been rewritten by it. As the years passed, Maya's story became more than a memory, it became a lesson carried across generations. Universities added her experience to leadership courses, documentaries were filmed, and her words were quoted in speeches around the world. Yet Maya remained grounded, often retreating to the quiet of her hometown where her journey had first begun. One afternoon, she visited a local school where students had prepared a mural in her honor. Painted across the wall were bold letters, "Claim your seat." Below it, children of every background had drawn themselves sitting proudly at tables of their own. Maya stood silently, tears welling in her eyes as a teacher whispered, "They don't just see you as a CEO. They see you as proof that they belong." At that moment, Maya understood the true power of her journey. The flight had ended long ago, but the movement it sparked was still taking off, reaching places she would never even step foot in. Looking at those young faces, she smiled softly and thought, "This was never just my fight. It was the beginning of theirs." And with that, Maya knew her story would live on, not in her, but in the countless voices rising because of her. As the years passed, Maya's story became more than a memory, it became a lesson carried across generations. Universities added her experience to leadership courses, documentaries were filmed, and her words were quoted in speeches around the world. Yet Maya remained grounded, often retreating to the quiet of her hometown where her journey had first begun. One afternoon, she visited a local school where students had prepared a mural in her honor. Painted across the wall were bold letters, "Claim your seat." Below it, children of every background had drawn themselves sitting proudly at tables of their own. Maya stood silently, tears welling in her eyes as a teacher whispered, "They don't just see you as a CEO. They see you as proof that they belong." At that moment, Maya understood the true power of her journey. The flight had ended long ago, but the movement it sparked was still taking off, reaching places she would never even step foot in. Looking at those young faces, she smiled softly and thought, "This was never just my fight. It was the beginning of theirs." And with that, Maya knew her story would live on, not in her, but in the countless voices rising because of her. Years later, Maya sat quietly on her porch, the sun setting in shades of gold across the horizon. She was no longer the busy CEO racing from one meeting to another, nor the public figure whose story had filled headlines. She was simply Maya, a woman who had lived, fought, and left her mark. A group of neighborhood children often visited her porch, eager to hear stories, and that evening was no different. One little girl asked, "Miss Maya, is it true someone once tried to take your seat on a plane?" Maya smiled gently, nodding. "Yes, it's true. But do you know what I learned that day?" The children leaned closer, eyes wide with anticipation. "I learned that our worth doesn't come from where we sit, but from knowing we belong wherever our hard work and heart have brought us." The children whispered to each other, nodding as if they understood more than their years should allow. Maya leaned back, her heart at peace. She realized her life had come full circle, the stolen seat had started a ripple, and now, the future was filled with countless voices who would never let theirs be silenced. As the last light faded, Maya closed her eyes, knowing she hadn't just approached the stage nervously. She was the very same teenage girl who once gave Maya a note saying, "One day, I'll sit in my rightful seat too." Now, she stood proudly as the newest director of the foundation. Choking back tears, she said, "Miss Maya, your courage gave me the courage to be here today. And I promise, we'll carry your torch forward." The room erupted in applause, and Maya, seated in the front row, felt her heart overflow. For the first time, she understood that her story had come full circle. What began with her fight for a single seat had grown into countless seats for others. Watching the young woman take the microphone, Maya smiled softly, realizing she no longer needed to lead. The next generation was ready. In her later years, Maya spent more time in quiet reflection than on stages or in boardrooms. She often visited the foundation's headquarters, not to give instructions, but simply to sit in the garden where students gathered between classes. She loved hearing their laughter, their big dreams, their fearless talk of changing the world. One afternoon, a young boy sat beside her and asked, "Miss Maya, do you ever regret what happened on that plane?" Maya looked at him, her eyes kind and wise. "No," she answered softly. "Because if that moment hadn't happened, maybe you wouldn't be sitting here today, dreaming bigger than I ever did." The boy nodded, smiling, and ran off to join his friends. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the sound of hope that filled the air. She realized her journey was no longer about her battles, her speeches, or even her victories. It was about the lives that carried her story forward. As the sun dipped low, Maya whispered to herself, one seat was stolen, but in return, thousands were created. And with that truth in her heart, she finally felt her legacy had taken root in soil that would never dry. As the seasons passed, Maya grew older, her steps slower but her spirit as strong as ever. She spent her mornings tending to a small garden behind her home, where bright flowers bloomed in every color. Neighbors often stopped by, children waved from the street, and former students from the foundation visited just to sit with her and listen. One evening, while watching the sunset from her porch, Maya received a call. It was the young woman who now led the foundation, the same girl who had once handed her that note. Her voice was filled with pride. "Miss Maya, today we opened our 50th Learning Center. All in your name." Maya closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. She thought back to the frightened silence on that plane, the sting of disrespect, and how it had transformed into this worldwide movement of hope. With a soft smile, she replied, "It was never in my name, it was in all of ours. Keep building, keep leading. My seat has long been taken, and now it's yours." When she hung up, Maya sat in the golden light, her heart full. She knew the torch had fully passed. And in that moment, she felt a peace deeper than she had ever known. In her final years, Maya became less of a public figure and more of a quiet presence, a symbol people carried in their hearts. She no longer needed stages, microphones, or headlines. Her story had already taken root in every corner of the world. One peaceful morning, she sat by her window with a cup of tea, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft gold. A scrapbook lay open on her lap, filled with letters, photos, and drawings sent from people whose children she had never met called her their hero. Leaders across nations credited her for inspiring their courage, and families wrote to say her story gave them hope when they felt unseen. Maya smiled, her hands gently resting on the pages. She whispered, "It was never just about me, it was always about us." As the light grew brighter, she leaned back, her heart calm and steady. That day, the world didn't lose Maya, it simply carried her forward in every voice that dared to claim its place. Her seat had never been only on a plane, nor even at a table, it was eternal, woven into history itself. And through the generations to come, her legacy would whisper the same truth: you belong.